So we're going along. We've gone over the mountain peak of Montesquieu here, Adam Smith here, de Tocqueville here. And I've drawn Marx as a volcano, topless, so to speak, in the volcanic sense, erupting in the 19th century, having enormous effect, obviously, on our world, equivalent. Basically, Montesquieu and Adam Smith provided the blueprint for capitalism and liberty and the Western way of life as we know it now. Marx provided the one alternative, and why he's like a volcano is not only his temperament and personality and his ideas, which were so explosive, but he's also, the volcano has subsided somewhat. I don't think communism is dead, but it's certainly more or less being put into cold storage, even in China now. So basically we can now examine him with all that froth away from him and begin to understand him. He's also not a very easy thinker. There are one or two straightforward ideas. And what I want to try and do in this lecture is to explain to you, and this has worked in the past, some of his basic ideas, which those two or three of you who know all this, please forgive me, but for most of you, you'll have heard these terms: relations of production, forces of production, alienation, surplus value, God knows. And he doesn't explain it very clearly himself. If you ever want to read anything about Marx, the work of David MacFarlane, who once taught me Latin and who is a Jesuit and has written a very good short biography of Marx, all his work, and he's the great editor of Marx, he edited the Grundrisse and so on. Anything by David MacFarlane is always extremely clear and helpful. There'll be something of his on the reading list. Okay, has everyone got the handouts? There should be two. Has everyone got? Which ones? Have you got the one with the pictures in? Okay, you need the ones with the pictures. Can you pass some of those around? Has anyone not got the one with the outline of the lecture? Okay, that's the outline of the lecture. Anyone else for a picture? Everyone got two now? Which? You need the picture. Okay, some pictures down there. This time I'm varying it and I'm not showing a picture on the overhead. I'm giving you the picture. The bristly man with the beard in the front is Marx. So starting with the outline which you've got on this sheet, which you can just annotate as usual. The man himself, well, he was born in 1818 of a comfortable middle-class family in Germany, of Jewish parents. First thing you need to understand about Marx is that he's an Old Testament prophet. He suddenly erupts in the middle of the 19th century as something out of about 5 centuries BC. He's a Judaic prophet. He's a very deeply Judaic, messianic, that is, sees the end of the world and utopia and so on. And this clearly is influenced by his upbringing in an Orthodox Jewish family, with a long line of rabbis on both sides of his family. He might have been a rabbi, Durkheim likewise next week. But he became dissolute. You'll be glad to hear that at university he engaged in dueling, poetry, and did nothing much, got scars and just philandered around for a while. Then he turned to law and philosophy and became a Hegelian, which I'll explain in a minute. He became more and more serious, though. He began to read Rousseau, Montesquieu, Machiavelli, and worked on Hegel's philosophy. He was a great polymath scholar in many ways. MacFarlane writes of him, which perhaps is worth quoting. He was a thinker on the grand scale. In a world of increasing specializations, it becomes difficult to follow a thinker who not only mastered so many disciplines, but also managed to integrate them. This is in MacFarlane's little Fontana book on Marx, page 8. He received a classical education and was steeped in a philosophy which drew its inspiration from antiquity in general and the aristocratic ideal of the Greek polis in particular. When tired of economics, Marx relaxed by reading Thucydides and the classical authors that were ever new. He read all Aeschylus in the original every year. He was one of the last Renaissance men. He read Greek, Latin, German, French, English, all the European languages, and knew a lot about this. So he's rather like Adam Smith and the rest of these great figures. He was a polymath with a great power of concentration and energy. Anyway, he was involved in various revolutionary politics, as you probably know, and after the failure of the 1848 revolutions in Europe and the publication of the Communist Manifesto, he went to England and lived in poverty in Soho, self-imposed poverty. He's always said he was very poor. He actually made a big thing of being poor, and later on in his life, with money from Engels, he was well off. He lived in Hampstead in a nice house, and on the whole was bourgeois, middle-class sort of character. His publications, there was a great burst really in 1857 to 8 when he composed more than 800 pages of his work, out of which most of his later work comes. And that's the Grundrisse, the Outlines of a Theory, which has been recently rediscovered, edited and published. And he wrote these 800 pages in less than 6 months, and they contain all the seeds of his later work on capital. His own, I mean, we always associate Marx with Das Kapital, which is in 3 volumes, but in his lifetime only the first volume was published, and the later volumes were edited by Engels. There's a rather nice story about his failure to write, which may comfort some of you when you're considering your next supervision essay. Early on in his life, he said, I'll write a book called Das Kapital in 3 volumes for his publisher. And in fact, he just failed to deliver. And this is a letter from his publisher in Leipzig. Dear Herr Doctor, you are already 10 months behind time with the manuscript of Das Kapital, which you have agreed to write for us. If we do not receive the manuscript within 6 months, we shall be obliged to commission another author to do the work. I hope you see the irony of that. Imagine, actually, Marx can't write capital blogs, you go and write Das Kapital, would you? Ridiculous, but anyway, it's a nice example of his prevarications and his difficulty in writing. So he went on, and he was very, very productive for a number of years, but towards the end of his life, he lived the life of a Victorian gentleman on the edge of Hampstead Heath, as I mentioned, from about 1869. He had a sort of stroke in 1873, and his life fragmented from about the age of 50. So everything that he really did, which was important, was done between about the age of 38 and 50. And of course, he famously worked away in the British Library, accumulating this mass of material, much of which has now been edited. So this is parts of the guy. He's very torn, he's living the life of a bourgeois, and yet very, very critical, and he sees the poverty and the misery around him with his friend Engels. Some of the contemporary events that influenced him, I've taken him as an example, one of the examples of that next phase. If you remember my first outline of the different paradigm shifts, he is a central example of the evolutionary paradigm. Darwin, Marx, Saylor, a number of anthropologists, Morgan and so on, are all examples of the great surge of evolutionary thought in the second half of the 19th century. And it's all interrelated. Darwin himself had a considerable influence on Marx, and vice versa. Well, not vice versa. Darwin wasn't aware of Marx, I don't think, except he's supposed to have written to Darwin and said, can I dedicate Das Kapital to you? But no replies, as far as I know, known. He said of Darwin that Darwin had applied to the animal kingdom the theory that Marx had discovered for the social kingdom, i.e. the competition, the selection, the survival of the fittest, all that sort of thing which you find in Darwin was a projection by Darwin of the world of capitalism, of late capitalism. That was Marx's theory. So the Darwinian and Wallace and the theory of evolution was one of the contemporary events that he was living through, and everyone was thinking in this new evolutionary way. Another thing happening in that period, of course, is the decline in formal religion. And he provides one of the first secular visions. It's still very religious in its underpinnings, but it appears to be secular, a secular vision of morality, purpose of life, because he asks these very deep questions, which is a sign of a great thinker. What is the basic nature of human beings? How did the modern world emerge? What is the nature of the modern world? And what is the future hope for mankind? Those are the questions he's asking, which are semi-religious questions, but not within an orthodox framework of religion. In many ways, Durkheim does the same thing, and Weber as well. So we're getting into a period when the social thinkers are taking over from religious thinkers as trying to provide a vision of our world. Another thing that influences him is something I talked about as I think lying behind a lot of these paradigm shifts, a huge disproportionate shift in power, which makes for great inequalities in the world. The second half of the 19th century was one where Western technologies, particularly the technologies of war, were so far in advanced that for the first time Europe cut right through other civilizations very easily. The greatest civilization on earth, China, was destroyed in the Opium Wars, or at least defeated by a small country in the Opium Wars. India was taken over, Africa was colonized, Islam was nowhere. Suddenly, one part of the world was just miles ahead, and with its machine guns and its bombs and its steam engines and steamships, it could do this. And I think this lies behind a lot of the evolutionary thought, because a lot of the social sciences were built up in a period, at this period, in trying to understand how you could place civilizations. We were right up at the top, technologically, democratically, in every way. And the scheme was to try and work out how societies could evolve towards this level. Some were there, some were there. So you got a kind of ladder model in which various civilizations were various points of this ladder. And this is one effect of a very unequal world. The social and economic effects of technology are terribly important, and that's why I put that as the next factor, industrialism. Because basically, the pessimism I talked about with Tocqueville was caused by the fact that it wasn't quite clear whether the Industrial Revolution was going to work, and anyway it had these terrible consequences. By the 1840s, when Marx was writing his work, it was clear that industrialism does work. It does. The escape from the world that Adam Smith thought there was no escape from a finite agrarian world living off the sun, was possible. It had happened in England successfully. It was beginning to bring forward its fruits, even if at a great cost, and it was beginning to spread very rapidly in Germany, France and Europe, and then 30 years later to Japan. So the world could progress technologically. There was optimism about this, even if there were huge costs. We weren't trapped in the way that Malthus and the classical economists like Smith thought. And this feeds into evolutionism as well, because we are evolving to a richer, better, more prosperous world. It is possible. I mentioned his involvement in the 1848 revolution in Europe and the failure of that revolution, but it was a time of excitement and enormous turbulence in Europe, and that was a background to his work. Of course, he noticed, as did Engels, the urban squalor and the rise of the working class, and a lot of his work is around trying to deal with a new class formation emerging out of industrialism and urbanism. But he also noticed the power of one particular country, Britain, which now was able to dominate much of the civilized world, and the growing power of America. Now, the methodology he used, I'll go through this very quickly because I want to get onto his substantive work, was basically comparative, like all these thinkers. He didn't just study one country, he studied the whole world. He was interested in China, he was interested in India, the whole world, and he was interested in comparing them. All his work is comparative. Every sentence is this compared to that, like all these great thinkers. His historical methodology, at one level you can say it's very deeply historical. That is to say, he's one of the last thinkers, and not many people do this now, who goes back right to the origins. He went back to hunting, gathering, tribal, and then on up to the present. The whole of history was interesting to him. His holistic approach, again, the anthropology of the world, everything, all aspects are interlinked, as I'll show you in a moment. Ideology, economy, religion, law, politics, technology, you can't separate them out. They're all interlinked. And to understand this world, you have to see them all interconnected. His method, the dialectical method, this may be the first thing that you've puzzled and wondered about. Basically what Hegel had suggested, and it's an old idea, it comes from Greek philosophy as well, is that one way to understand phenomena is to look at basically what the structure of a good undergraduate essay should be. Basically, thesis, so-and-so says, Leach says this, antithesis, Friedman says that, synthesis, but I say this. You probably all know that this is how you should be modelling your essays on. But that is the dialectical method. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. That's what the dialectic is. And that was the method he applied. And it is, as a method, it is not static. That's the great beauty of it. Because what happens is that you get a synthesis, but then the synthesis becomes the thesis. And there's another antithesis, and out of that explodes another. And this is why the class systems of the West and everywhere are so unstable, because they congeal for a moment, and then the antithesis comes and hits them, and you get further development. So this is the dialectical method. The materialism is, of course, the famous inversion of Hegel. Hegel and many people are what are known as idealists, and they thought that ideas and ideologies determine this physical world. Marx turned Hegel on his head by saying, no, it's the material world, and I'll give you a quotation on this in a minute. It's the material world that determines our ideas. It's the other way around. Our consciousness is a product of our material world. The teleology means that you have a thesis which suggests that you are moving towards a definite goal or end. History has a meaning and a purpose, and it's going towards that. If you write a book, for example, The End of History, like Fukuyama, it means that you think that we have reached the end. Most people are not so sure. But anyway, there's a movement towards an end, and this, of course, comes back to his messianic Old Testament vision. Christianity is a teleological religion, unlike most world religions. It says there are stages, and we are moving towards the second coming and the kingdom of Christ. And Judaism has a similar view of a movement towards a definite goal. If you have such a view, and if you know what the goal is, which Marx claimed he did, then it's very, very powerful, because you can say to people, look, you're living through this agony, or you don't know which way to go that way, because that's where we're aiming. That's what teleology is about. Evolutionary stages and progress. Basically, he had read, of course, all the 18th century philosophers like and social theorists like Adam Smith, and he accepted basically the framework which underpins most anthropology: tribal, peasant, modern, etc., etc. The difference with him was that he was the mechanisms. He actually he filled in these stages in more detail than the great 18th century writers, and he gave a mechanism for the change from one to the other. The 18th century, if you remember, had argued that yes, you have these modes of production and they change, but it's really the technology changes, so you get introduction of ploughs or whatever it is. He said that is the phenomenon, that's the surface. You get ploughs and then you get steam engines and so on. But the dynamics of the change are to do with social structures and relations, which I'll talk about in a minute. I've emphasized again and again that all these thinkers are structural thinkers and relational thinkers, in that they don't see the meaning of the world we live in things themselves, but in the relations between things. And he was a structural thinker in the tradition that goes on, starts with Montesquieu and ends up with Levi-Strauss and modern structuralists. Not things, but relations of things are what are important. And he was a world historian. Now, both to summarize his methodology and to give you an introduction to what he argued and said, if you'd like to take the picture which you've now absorbed of this gentleman, and there's a life of him and a few of the salient facts on the other side. If you turn that over and look at two things more or less simultaneously, if you're able to do that. This diagram here, when I was trying to understand Marx many years ago, an article came out by Jonathan Friedman, who was a Marxist anthropologist, in what used to be called Man, New Society, Volume 9, Number 3, called Marxism, Structuralism and Vulgar Materialism. Every student at that time read that article. They don't now, but it has a diagram on it, page 445, which is this diagram here. And I found it terribly helpful. I used to carry it around in my pocket because I could never remember what forces of production were, or relations of production, or social formations. It's all magical words to me. Friedman put it into that diagram there. And so you have a social formation, capitalism, feudalism, whatever it is, divided into infrastructure and superstructure. The superstructure consists of the political and the legal side and the ideological side. That's above. The infrastructure consists of the forces of production, which are the tools, and the relations of production, that is the relations between landlords and serfs and so on. And that's it. Although I'm not sure that I haven't left something out of it. Let's just check. Yes, I have. Thought it was a bit bare. I'll rub this out. This is just something I talked about in another set of lectures. These are the modes of production: the tribal, the Asiatic, the ancient, the feudal, and the Germanic. But it's probably more important that you have this. The forces of production are divided into the means of production, which are tools, and the organization of production, how you work. Now that's the Marxist schemata, and this of course determines that. The forces of production, and the dialectic occurs when these clash. The infrastructure clashes with the superstructure. When you get some change down here, often in the means of production, in the tools, like the steam engine or something like that, and it feeds up, it affects the relations of production, and then that affects that. Now, if you have a look at that, the back of the picture there, I'll just read you this out because this seems to summarize almost all of this aspect of Marx's work very well, and it's worth just going through it. You'll see all this reflected in his writing. Start about at the bit at the bottom, which is sidelined, the general conclusion. Okay? The general conclusion at which I arrived, and which, once reached, became the guiding principle of my studies, can be summarized as follows. This is from his contribution to the critique of political economy, Grundrisse, part of Grundrisse. In the social production of their existence, men inevitably enter into definite relations, which are independent of their will, namely relations of production, appropriate to a given stage in the development of their material forces of production. Relations of production, forces of production. He's talking about that level at the moment. The totality of these relations of production constitute the economic structure of society, the real foundation on which arises a legal and political superstructure, and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness, ideology. The mode of production of material life conditions the general process of social, political, and intellectual life. It is not the consciousness of men, and this is the inversion of Hegel, it's not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness. At a certain stage of development, the material productive forces of society, this area, forces of production, come into conflict with the existing relations of production, or, that's these clash, or, this merely expresses the same thing in legal terms, with the property relations within the framework of which they have operated hitherto. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into their fetters. There's a clash. Then begins an era of social revolution. The changes in the economic foundation lead sooner or later to the transformation of the whole immense superstructure. In studying such transformations, it is always necessary to distinguish between a material transformation of the economic conditions of production, which can be determined with the precision of natural science. You can look and see if they're using hoes and ploughs and the labour input and the relations of production and so on. And the legal, political, religious, artistic or philosophic, in short, ideological forms in which men become conscious of this conflict and fight it out. You fight out at a imaginative and unreal level battles which are really about something else. just to take a random example, you might go to war with Iraq and say this is an ideological war against terrorism or something, and some people might say you're actually fighting about the oil resources in Iraq, for example. I wouldn't ever say such a thing, but no social order. Let's see. Just as one does not judge an individual by what he thinks about himself, so one cannot judge such a period of transformation by its consciousness, but on the contrary, this consciousness must be explained from the contradictions of material life, from the conflict existing between the social forces of production and the relations of production, as we've had. No social order is ever destroyed before all the productive forces for which it is sufficient have been developed, and new superior relations of production never replace older ones before the material conditions for their existence have matured within the framework of the old society. So if you were, say, regarding China today, you'd say that internally all these things are changing, the relations of production and the forces of production, and the old ideology is still there, but one day it will just flop over, and maybe flopping over at the moment. Mankind thus inevitably sets itself only such tasks as it is able to solve, since closer examination will always show that the problem itself arises only when the material conditions for its solution are already present, or at least in the course of formation. And then he gives the types. The whole of this is a social formation. This is a mode of production, this bit down here. That's the mode of production. This is a social formation. And these are the main social formation. In broad outline, the Asiatic, the ancient, the feudal and the modern bourgeois modes of production may be designed as epochs marking progress in the economic development of society. Well, you see there, even there's a contradiction between what I said and what he writes. He says these are modes of production, and I defined it as these. He wavers about in these terms, I'm afraid. But on the whole, it's safer to distinguish them like that. So, a few of the conclusions with that model in your mind. Firstly, what is basic about this is property relations. The relations of production. Who owns what in what relationship? And this is what distinguishes different kinds of society. I've talked about this in other lectures, and basically, if you remember, in the simpler societies, property is communally held. In the Asiatic and ancient mode, property is held by virtue of being a citizen. In other words, it's held by the state. In the Germanic or feudal system, as he calls it, property has become individualized down to the level of the household or the family. And then capitalism arose that last communalism, and we own property to a certain extent in our bodies, in our world, and so on. So property has become fully individualized. That is really the great dynamic of history, that property relationship. Secondly, there's his argument about the importance of the struggle, especially the class struggle. The contradictions you get as the means of production and the forces of production, the tools and so on, get better, then class struggles occur. I mean, there are many, many famous ones. I mean, what he's basically saying is, if a certain group of people, say the bourgeois, say there's a great increase in the wealth and power of merchants, they will want more share of the political power, and they may come up against the old landed aristocracy, say in 19th century Britain, and destroy them. So there'll be a political and social revolution. Or, to take China today, you may get new entrepreneurial, city-dwelling people who are no longer satisfied with the old division of power and may try and take that power away. So basically, there's a shift in the way wealth is made, distributed, and this creates social classes and contradictions and clashes between classes. And that is the dynamic of history. The problem, of course, with that, and this is why he has this peculiar view that certain societies can't become capitalist. The Asiatic, that is India and China and the rest, the ancient, the Greeks, the Romans, most civilizations weren't heading towards capitalism and couldn't achieve it because basically they didn't have a class structure. Basically, property was held, as I explained, either by the village or the lineage or the corporate group, or by the city, and therefore you didn't have a class system, and therefore the dynamic that begins to be behind the development towards capitalism can't occur in those cases. They are dead ends. They're stuck. Class struggles, therefore, only occur in certain civilizations. Of course, with such a view, he's completely stuck, because if all societies started as tribal, it's the old question, if they all started as tribal societies, how is it that they first got their class systems? There's a chicken and egg problem which has bugged all those who try to apply Marx. You've got to have capitalism. In other words, you've got to have capitalism before capitalism, because how do you begin to bootstrap, as they say in computing? How do you begin to start to get into the class system? So you've got to have some private property to start the system going. I've talked about the infra and superstructures. Might be worth just mentioning there that this deterministic model, and this is where the materialism comes and the inversion, is what many people find unsatisfactory about the arguments. It's where the person I'll be talking about the week after next, Max Weber, in a sense contends with Marx, because Weber keeps an absolutely balanced. He says, sometimes this determines this, sometimes this determines that. You can't tell. And it's not just superstructure and infrastructure. And some anthropologists, for example, Godelier, the French Marxist anthropologist, I remember well, it's just an anecdote, but Godelier came and gave a paper, or attended a conference I was organizing in the mid-70s, and he said, I can say this in England and in English, but I no longer believe in the determination of the superstructure by the infrastructure. I can't say this in France, because I would be told I'd sold out, and all my disciples and friends and students would be in great moral quandary, but I no longer believe it. And of course, as you know, some modern Marxists have managed to get round this by saying, well, in fact, although it's always the infrastructure in the last instance, which is a famous phrase, determines this, you can define what you like as the infrastructure. So the usual way out of this is to say kinship, for example. Kinship relations, social relations of kinship, which encapsulate in simple societies economics, that is the infrastructure. Or in India, in the famous case, caste is the infrastructure. Now, once you start diluting this message down to saying kinship is infrastructure in Africa or caste in India, it's really getting well away from the classical formulation. It's probably true, but it's a weakening of it. The modes of production and the stages theory I've talked about. Another famous theory which is important to realize is why capitalism is doomed, according to Marx. Capitalism is doomed because basically, if you're making a product, you have certain factors which go into the costs of that product. You have classically land, labor, and technology. And what happens through the progress of history is that early on, capitalism emerged as technology got better. But in the late phase, once you've got steam engines and modern capitalism, basically this gets huge and squeezes out that. So you no longer need laborers. An industrialist, a capitalist, will invest in technology and not in people. The wages of these people drop, and you have a huge unemployed, desperate set of people, as he saw around him in Manchester and elsewhere, who will bring about a revolution. To take it in its modern form, you get the paperless office and the secretary-less office. You may have noticed that his predictions on these matters, if he'd addressed such matters, are not quite true. Our office next door is more and more full of paper. Machines, i.e. computers, have not replaced human beings. You'll be glad to hear, or sad, they just create more work and more paper. So it wasn't quite as he predicted, but it made sense at the time to think that capital would be congealed, as he put it, wealth would be congealed into machinery and ways of producing wealth rather than in people, and this would lead to a clash between the machines, the machine breakers and so on, and the people, and this desperation would overthrow capitalism. That was really one of the reasons for its likely decline. The second reason is that it's a morally deeply flawed system which destroys individual human beings, and I'll come on to that after my customary break. Is it about at the right level for you? Okay. Which would you like? Both of them, right. Have you all got this? Have you finished with this bit? Can I rub this out? Okay. Right. You should all be recovered now. I was going to say, this is the end of 5th week, in case you hadn't noticed. So this is the low point in the term, psychologically and every other way, the end of 5th week. So things begin to lift up again. So if your spirits are a bit low, you'll be tired, and the weather's not very nice, and the political situation's not very nice. So, but from previous experience, things will begin to lighten in the 6th, 7th, 8th weeks as you come towards the end of term. So don't be downcast. I mention that because you all sound quite cheerful and you're chatting to each other, so that's good news. But anyway, back to Karl Marx. The division, capitalism was bound to collapse because it's an inhuman and unjust and ridiculous system, so he thought. Firstly, there's this is the second point I made here, the division of labour. This is the point that I've hammered with both Smith and Tocqueville. Who wants to make the heads of pins for the rest of their lives? Much of the work in capitalist economies comes out of the efficiency of dividing tasks and making them thereby pointless and meaningless. It's not just the division of labour, though, it's the commodification of your lives. In other words, if you're an artist, which is an extreme case, if you make a pot and you make something beautiful and you keep it and you admire it and your friends admire it and you put a great deal of your soul and life into this thing, if it's wrenched away from you, alienated from you, then you've lost something of your own personality, and that is the basis of capitalism, that you constantly alienate bits of yourself onto the market, which are then taken by other people. So it's a dehumanizing system. This takes one really to one of his great moral critiques, and it's important to understand this because many very distinguished people don't seem to understand it. What Marx thought the individual was like, in many ways he was like Rousseau. He's an optimist. He thought that human beings, basically in their original state, are not separated out from their environment. He was an environmentalist. We are part of the world. We are an animal species which mixes in with other animal species. We're not separated out. We don't have private property in the world around us. We have relations with other people. We are relational persons who live in for millions of or hundreds of thousands of years in this form, as almost he talks about us as herd animals. We live as members of herds. Our meaning comes from other people, not from our own activities, and therefore there is no individualism, there's no private property, there's no me and you, there's no me and the outside world. The famous Cartesian split between mind and body, between the human and the material world, has not occurred at that point. Now, it's important to understand that he basically has a corporatist, that we are all part of a larger body view of, because the person who's written more on this subject than almost any other anthropologist, Louis Dumont, in a book called From Mandeville to Marx, about Marx, completely misunderstands this. He thinks that Marx started with an original individualism and then moved on, and it completely skews his whole analysis and makes the book more or less worthless. If you think I'm just vaporizing and I've just invented this, or if you want to pursue this at all, look at my aforesaid website under Dumont. You'll see a paper I wrote about that book, Mandeville to Marx. But basically, you've got to understand that his criticism of the West, or capitalism, is based on this moral idea that our instinct is to be joined up with other people, not to be separate. Back to the womb, if you like, or whatever you like to call it. But basically, the separations of modern life are a tragedy, and they go against our deepest nature. And this is his basic vision. So what the market and capitalism does is to break this down. Increasing efficiency is at the cost of human warmth and meaning. It's a theme that will come up again with Ernest Gellner, who felt in some ways the same dichotomy. And I think perhaps I can anticipate I've been on your behalf reading various books and thinking about this a bit further, and I've come across something which I think may be helpful now or in the future, and it relates to this, which is what Marx thinks gives value to objects and people. His theory of value, which isn't on this, but I think it's worth, because I've at last, I think, vaguely understood it. If you remember, the classical theory of what gives value to objects in classical economics of Adam Smith's time was a completely morally neutral idea that you have supply, demand, price. So any price is really fair, because if there's a high demand and a small supply, then the price will go up, and that's fair, and the market will act in equilibrium, and this is how markets work, and nothing is unfair in that world. I mean, if people will pay the money, then that's what it's worth. So that's the classical theory, that the value can be seen by the price, which is seen from that relation. That's the classical theory and the neoclassical theory and the capitalist theory of markets. It's amoral. Demand, you don't think much about. It's caused by you want a thing. Maybe it's influenced by obviously things like the amount of money and the amount of capital and the height of desire for such objects and so on, but you don't really concentrate much on that. We leave that as a black empty box. Supply is dictated by the amount of the factors of production, land, labor, technology and other things, and they come into interaction. Now, Marx read all that stuff, and he said it's a trick, because basically there is another way of looking at value of things, which is the labor theory of value, which is as follows, as far as I can work it out. He concentrated on the production side, or the supply side, and he said that production is the result of the input of various factors of production. So when you make something or do something, if you grow a field of rice or you make a pot or whatever it is, you put into that several factors of production. You put in your labor, you put in a bit of rice land, you put in some oxen, whatever it is. And you work on that bit of thing, and out of it comes something which, if you keep it, because of the result of natural forces, time, the sun, and so on, and water, you put in a certain, say, 7 units of something or other, and the total output will be more. You'll get 10 units of whatever it is, energy. If you put it down to carbohydrates or something like that, there will be 10 units. This bit here is the surplus value. That's over and above what's been put into it. Now, in earlier civilizations and most societies, that surplus value goes back to the person who's put the labor in. And that's fair and just. What capitalism does, through this mechanism here, is to give a price for the thing. You sell it, and the price may be just a little bit more than you put in your labor. You just make a very small profit. All the rest of it, the surplus value, goes to someone else, either the buyer or your landlord. In other words, the surplus value is expropriated to someone other than yourself. And that is the iniquity of the system. It looks as if it's fair, and yet really all that effort and work and thought and skill that's gone into something is not being properly rewarded. It's going to someone else. Now, the capitalists would argue that actually it's fair because a lot of the factors of production, maybe the oxen and the land, are actually theirs. So in a sharecropping system, for instance, they should get half the profit. But that's what the argument is about. The surplus value and the costs, and it's a moral theory about who should be getting the surplus value. Now, that much you may or may not have comprehended. I hadn't fully understood it until I tried to explain it to you, but I have now come across a third theory, which I think you'll come across, and I think is quite interesting, which is which, instead of focusing on production, focuses on demand and consumption. It arose out of really what you might call, if you don't think this is frivolous, the Tracy Emin problem. Tracy Emin is the lady who makes art objects, among other things, including her unmade bed. And people like Saatchi pay hundreds of thousands of pounds for Tracy Emin's unmade bed. Now, how do you explain that? Tracy Emin hasn't put much labour into not making her bed and selling it for £100,000. There are lots of unmade beds around, so the laws of supply and demand can't be very effective in this case. So you need another theory to give the value that Saatchi is prepared to pay for Tracy Emin's unmade bed, or the formaldehyde pig, or whatever example you like. So in case of luxuries and artworks, this doesn't really work. And so out of the work of the great German sociologist Simmel, in his work on money, there's evolved a theory which has been taken up by Alfred Gell and Appaduri and others. Gell, you may have come across this, which is that basically the value in this equation of production and consumption and purchase, you need to look a lot at this side, the desire side, the consumption side. And what gives, in many cases, a skewed value to things are things like prestige and status. People's feeling that this is very posh to have this. It may not be better wine, but it's got a nice label on the front, or the car may not inside be any better, but it will give you prestige and status. So people are constantly seeking something beyond the utility value of things. So there's that element in desire. Secondly, there's the element of the difficulty of procuring this object. And this is the problem that Simmel talked about. But basically, what resists your procurement, what puts up a fight, as he puts it in his famous metaphors, against being appropriated by the consumer. Someone says, no, I won't let you have this. That battle to appropriate and absorb the difficulty of things. I mean, taking a frivolous example, the high value of certain French anthropologists and sociologists may not be unrelated to the fact that it's almost impossible to understand what they're saying. You have to struggle really hard to understand Foucault or Bourdieu or Levi-Strauss, and it's not clear they understand what they're saying. Now, if they wrote it simply and clearly, it would be first-year stuff, as it's written in this obscure way and difficult to understand. It's third-year stuff and highly valued. Well, that's a cynical view of someone who hasn't the fame and ability to write in that way. But you see what I mean. It's a struggle, and the struggle gives you some virtue. The third element, which Alfred Gell talks about and others, is the perceived difficulty of creating the thing. Now, it's not difficult to make an unmade bed, but many works of art, you think, gosh, I couldn't have written a Bach cantata. There's no way, which is true, or painted a Leonardo. It must have been terribly difficult, and so you perceive it as difficult and you value it highly. So this is a third theory of value, which sort of incorporates, to a certain extent, both. It's got the labour theory in that it's a difficult task. Anyway, those are three theories, and the middle one of Marx is a critique of capitalism. I've talked, just to finish off the last points here, I've talked about the deviations from the path, the stationary, Asiatic and other modes, and the way in which, for strange reasons, which he does try and tackle, why feudalism and the Germanic system emerged and broke away from the normal tendency towards stationary systems. He does talk about, and if you're interested in, I've written a bit more about this, and again it's on my website, and the importance of the feudalism as a gateway to capitalism. Only out of feudalism, he thought, could you get capitalism. I've talked about the future utopia of communism. Basically, the elimination of the state, of private property, and so on, will lead to a fair, just, equal, and so on world. We all know that, however high-minded his original theories may have been, it doesn't work. It ends up with Pol Pot, Stalin, Chairman Mao. Not always, but there's a tendency. So if he'd known what he was going to unleash on the world, I hope he might have paused for a second. Anyway, if you believe in the utopia of communism, you won't be dissuaded by me. Productive and dynamic tensions of history is, I've talked about the dialectical and the tensions of the class system, and the convergence of systems, as you know, he thought they would all converge in the end in the destruction of capitalism and bourgeois societies towards a world utopia of communism. The effects and importance of technology. He wasn't a technological determinist, but he did see very strongly how important technologies were. Sometimes he gave this in an aphorism, his famous aphorism that the plough created feudalism and the steam engine created capitalism, is a sort of concentration of this. Technologies, as he saw, were not things but relations. In famous phrase of Mauss, M-A-U-S-S, his famous definition of technology is traditional effective action, not a thing, but a way you use things and so on. And in that sense, Marx thought that technologies changed our world. So he really is a very great thinker, but in the end, I think he's flawed and will be complimented, I hope, not next week. I'm afraid if you like and love Durkheim, can't bear to hear anything about him, don't come next week. But if when we get on to Max Weber, you'll hear of another great peak. Thank you very much indeed.